excited to have you with us this morning and glad to have you here. Just before we get started, if everyone could please make sure you keep yourself muted throughout the tour. And if you have any questions, you will be able to use the chat feature. And then we'll get to those at the end of the tour. If you're joining us from Facebook, there you can use the comment section to comment any questions, and we'll get to those at the end as well. Lastly, we are streaming this live through our Facebook page, and they are recorded. And so if you would like to go back and watch any of our previous lectures, they're all going to be on our Facebook page. So if in case you missed one or you just want to see what we've done in the past, those are all available. And we still have a number of people joining right now, so we'll just wait a minute or two more. But all right. Let's see. Okay. I think we can go ahead and get started now that it's 11. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Karen, who is presenting about Mannerism today.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. And without Sarah and Scott, I could not do these lectures because they so graciously host them for me. So a little shout out to them. Mannerism is a really distinct and unusual time period in art. And it isn't one of these great movements as we look at the Renaissance or the Baroque. It's kind of I hate to say, a little bit of a secondary movement because it evolves out of the Renaissance. Some people would consider it as a subcategory of Renaissance painting, but I look at it as just a very unique and fascinating period of art that lasts from about 1530 to 1600. We see evidence of Mannerism primarily in Italy, Florence to be exact, and Rome a bit. Later in the talk, I will show you some examples of Northern Mannerism, particularly the work of Jan Bruegel the Elder, for example, who was a great Flemish painter, descendant of Jan Peter Bruegel the Elder, who we have at the Timken Museum. So what is Mannerism? Maniera means a manner or style, and it's kind of funny. Mannerism really means in Italian the stylish style. And I'll tell you why it's called the stylish style. So Mannerism coincides with an upheaval and sort of war-torn time. There was the Reformation, Protestant Reformation that begins in 1517. There was a plague that rages through Europe and actually causes the demise of several important artists. Raphael, for example, who was a high Renaissance artist. And also in 1527, the devastating sack of Rome, which I will be talking about a little bit later. Now, you have to recall that in the medieval times, the Middle Ages, art was very much directed toward and sponsored by the church. So many of the images that you would see in painting and altar pieces, triptychs and diptychs, etc., would be of religious significance. But after 1517, when we begin to see the Protestant Reformation, we begin to see a shift. Protestant subject matters, and also in Italy, because I said that's primarily where we're going to be looking, we have these great families that are sponsoring many of these artists. Of course, the great Medici family and Cosimo de' Medici. There was many of these Medici family members who did sponsor this art. The other thing is, remember the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical interest in humanism, antiquity, Greco-Roman literature and art. And so we're going to see some very mythologically based paintings and also some erotic paintings. Not overtly erotic, but you are going to see a lot more of nudity and things like that in the paintings. I also wanted to bring up a person that I really haven't talked about, and he does factor in to Mannerism. Again, that period 1530 to 1600, Mannerism stops basically because of the evolving Baroque period. Now, some of the early paintings I'm going to show you toggle between about 1520, a little earlier than this date I said, but they are showing emerging signs of Mannerism. So sometimes in periods of art, for example, you might see paintings in the 1700s that are still Baroque and not necessarily Rococo. So sometimes there's a little bit of a carryover. So we can't always be so fixed on the dates. But the person I wanted to bring up is Giorgio Vasari. So Vasari was an Italian Renaissance. He was a painter, he was an architect, a philosopher, a historian. He was considered a good painter during his lifetime, which was 1511 to 1574, but subsequently his art has been kind of demoted a bit, so I am not really showing you any of his paintings, but I did want to discuss him because he was considered a Mannerist painter, and he also promoted a lot of ideas of Mannerism, and his writings really were the basis of art history. So we learn about people like Michelangelo, Leonardo, and also the culture of the Medicis, because he was the court ambassador for the Medici court. All right, so I'm going to tell you, we're going to look at this exquisite painting and Madonna with a long neck, and it won't be the first one we'll talk about, but again, I want to tell you a little bit about the characteristics of Mannerism, and this is probably one of the most profoundly Manneristic paintings. Now, if you look at it, this is Madonna with a long neck, Parmigianino. We're going to discuss, he was one of the great Mannerist painters. The first thing I want to point out to you is this thing called figura serpentinata. Figura serpentinata means it's a style, and serpentine, you think about curvilinear forms. What is a serpentine style? You see it a lot. It's very pervasive, very ubiquitous in Mannerist painting, and that's when the torso is the upper body and the lower body is not always in sync. And you see that a bit with the baby Jesus, not as defined as some paintings I'll show you, but there's this kind of elongated curvilinear form to the body. Now, also look at the long neck. That is a very unusual proportional change in Mannerism. And also look at the elongated body of the baby Jesus. He's not that compacted, cuddly form. He's almost falling off her lap. So it really, Mannerism really, as I said, begins in Italy. And it was a response to this very harmonious classicism, the idealized high Renaissance painting. And people like Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo were considered the preeminent high Renaissance artists, but it was Michelangelo really who started showing elements of this change, this evolution, this unique qualities of Mannerist painting. And we're going to look in a minute at his Last Judgment fresco that definitely shows Manneristic tendencies. So figures in Mannerism had very graceful body structure. Like, look at this magnificent Madonna. I mean, that elongated neck, those beautiful robes. Color was profoundly important. Light too, but color especially. They use a lot of complementary colors. When you think of that, you think of, red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple. They strident, very bold colors. You have elongated limbs. You can see that here. They actually think in this painting, Madonna with the long neck, that she might have had this syndrome called Marfan syndrome, because those hands are like very unusual, beautiful, exquisite, but so elongated. The poses seem contrived, even as we look at this Madonna and Child, because it almost looks like the baby Jesus is falling off the lap. So that's a bit of a stylistic change. They like to flaunt the rules of classicism. Muscles could be almost grotesquely overemphasized. There's a lot of movement. And lastly, I will say that the space is very shallow. So if you look at this, you do not see an attempt to really extend perspective, for example. It's more about crowding the picture plane. Just really quickly, I mentioned the sack of Rome, which does affect artists moving from city to city. Sack of Rome was an attack on the city of Rome by the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And they came in, mostly Protestants, sort of against Catholicism, and they really kind of tried to sort of rampage through, like marauders, rampage through Rome, and that caused a lot of artists to flee Rome. So I just wanted to point that out because it was a factor. All right, so let's look at the work of the great Michelangelo, the Last Judgment fresco. This was done 25 years after he did the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And so let's talk a little bit about who Michelangelo was. Most of you do have some working knowledge of him because he is one of the most important artists of all time. So he was a panel painter, a fresco painter, a sculptor, an architect. He even wrote sonnets. Brilliant, brilliant man. He was the first artist really who everybody recognized was a genius in his time. And he fortunately lived into his 80s. So he had a very long life, a very productive life. He was born in the town of Caprese in 1470, and he trained with the great Ghirlandaio. So then under the auspices of Lorenzo de' Medici in about 1496, when he was a very young man, he went to Rome and he actually carved the Pietà for St. Peter's. So at early 20s, he was already being recognized as a great sculptor. He went back to Florence in about 1501. He began many projects, not all of them finished. And then he began to paint and I'm moving a little bit ahead because we can't go through everything he did, but he began to paint the vault of the Sistine Chapel, which were scenes from the Old Testament. And that began to lead to this movement showing some kind of manneristic qualities in his paintings. But the one that we're going to really look at is the Last Judgment, because that's where we really see just this profound shift to a manneristic style. And so he really brought about great strides in art at that time and just really recognized as a complete genius. Okay, so let's look at the fresco here. And this is at the back of the wall, the Last Judgment. It covers the whole back wall of Sistine Chapel. It depicts the second coming of Christ and the final eternal judgment of mankind. And so before I kind of go over each aspect of it, let's just talk a little bit about why we consider it manneristic, part of the Mannerist tradition. Look at all these sort of twisted, heavily muscular forms. It's very dramatic. It's a very shallow space. The colors are not as profound as you will see in some of the subsequent paintings, but you see a lot of bright colors here. And remember, this is the fresco after it was refurbished. It took something like 20 years to refurbish it. I believe they began in the 1970s, went into the 1990s, and they refurbished both the Last Judgment and the Sistine Chapel. The colors that are profoundly used here with this exquisite blue, and then also we have these flesh tones, these very, I would say gradation of flesh in the terms of like the deeper colors, and then of course this really kind of paler shade, as it were. Okay, so the dead rise and let's say the good rise and the not so good descend into what would be considered hell. But because Michelangelo was so steeped in antiquity and in not only the art of antiquity, but also the writings of the writers from that time period, the mythology, he actually includes mythological elements into this. So first we'll look at the body of Christ here with Mary. No beard, he's not on a throne, and he's got this golden aura about him. Well, that represents kind of acknowledgement of Apollo, the god of the sun, god of Greco mythology. And then we have Sharon with the guiding the people down the river Styx. And so again, that's very mythological. And then Midas is in here somewhere. And then we go back to Catholicism, and we see here, this is the very own St. Bartholomew right here, and I hope you can see it's just below Christ here, and he's holding a skin. And so remember, we have a beautiful St. Bartholomew at the Timken, and of course it's Baroque, not Mannerist, but he always holds a knife because his form of martyrdom is being flayed with a knife. And here we can see a skin representing him and the face of Michelangelo. So, there's a quotation here. And then we have something like 300 forms in this. We have architectural elements, this arch, and column. And, we have so many aspects of the human condition, greed and the seven sins. And then you can actually see elements of it as these bodies descend. We have St. Peter here holding the keys of the kingdom. I'm looking for him here. It's not always right here. And so we have not only biblical, but mythological reference to it. So it's just a very important work of art. And as I mentioned, he began this in his 60s. Took him 4 years. And it was done 25 years after the Sistine Chapel. So it's the Last Judgment, and it's 39 feet high by 45 feet wide. It's just an incredible work of art. Okay, so now we're going to move away from the efforts of Michelangelo, and we're going to go to another incredible artist called Andrea del Sarto. And Andrea del Sarto was from the family of tailors, Sarto being, sartorial, where that word comes from. He was a leading Florentine painter of the early 16th century. And again, if you look at the date, you might say, well, I thought you said Mannerism is 1530 to about 1600. Of course, there's always predecessors to the movement and aspects of painting that begin to lead us into a new concept in art. So he was a great influence on Pontormo and Parmigianino. Those are considered the quintessential Mannerist painters. I'm going to show you the work, of course. And Vasari wrote about him. He thought his work was sublime. He was influenced greatly by Raphael and others, and he was mostly active in Florence. However, he did move about 1518 to France, where he worked for Francis I, and he became part of the Fontainebleau School. So let's talk about this painting in particular, Madonna of the Harpies. Exquisitely painted, these rich colors. And as I mentioned, the colors, I don't call them acerbic, I just call them rich and deep. And so you see that with the Madonna. Look at the robe, St. John the Evangelist here, that really exquisite orange robe. You see the Madonna in her ubiquitous red and blue. You almost always see Madonna with some element of red and blue in her clothing. And then St. Francis here with a small crucifix. You have these little putti clutching her. And then, of course, she's holding the baby Jesus, who shows this sort of Mannerist tendency with this elongated body and sort of muscular twisted form. Now, what is happening in the painting is this. She is standing on a pedestal, and the bas relief, so bas relief being BAS, sculptural relief that is not freestanding, comes out of a wall or a column right here. And these are either locusts or harpies. And they are associated with winds, the harpies, the winds, but it could also be locusts. But regardless, they both reference evil. So what is she doing? She's metaphorically placing her foot on the pedestal and stamping out evil. So that's why we have that. One thing that Mannerism does not have is static forms. This is a painting that shows movement. So even with St. John the Evangelist, he's stepping down from the platform. The Madonna is in contrapposto, which is a sculptural element where you're standing steady with one leg and then bending with another. And so this was actually commissioned for a hospital in Florence. So deep, rich colors showing the importance of Madonna and her control over stamping out evil and showing goodness and kindness in the world. All right. Rosso Fiorentino. Rosso being a nickname because he had red hair. And this is so much quintessential Mannerist painting. So Moses defending the daughters of Jethro. I will tell you just a little bit about him. He was born in Florence. Again, most of the artists we're going to look at either were around the area of Florence or worked in Florence. He trained with the previous artist, Andrea del Sarto, and also Pontormo. You're going to see pretty soon. In 1523, he moved to Rome, and he didn't live very long. He lived just into his 40s, but he saw the work of Michelangelo and Raphael, and he was very inspired. But because of the sack of Rome, which I mentioned, that occurs in 1527, he too flees to France and works for the court of Francis I. So let's talk specifically about this painting. And here we have the story. So what happens is, it's a biblical episode, comes from Exodus. And Moses was at this time in an area called, I hope I can pronounce right, Mendianite. Mendianite. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it. It's on the Sinai Peninsula, and he was located there, and he overheard some of these shepherds who lived in that region, the Sinai, now the Sinai Peninsula, and he overheard these shepherds saying, those daughters of Jethro, they're quite beautiful. Maybe we can spend some time with them, and maybe not in the most positive way. And he was outraged. He was angry. He said, how dare he? How could he possibly think that way? And I'm going to be the protector of these women. So here he is, Moses here, in this twisted, turning posture with heavy muscles. And remember I said, that serpentinata, you can see that here. And then probably the most important form in this painting is this body here. It became actually an example of how artists would use would depict the male body. And so this actually became sort of used more than once, not replicated completely, but that twisted turning body. And also we have this horror on the faces of some of these shepherds. Like, oh my God, what's happening? And then we have tension and movement. And again, I remember I said the space is very crowded. We don't have depth. The only depth we really see is here in these like housing buildings and this little like a balcony here. And then we have this kind of cape that's flailing in the wind, and we have these sheep right here. So he really foreshortens the bodies. So the man on the right stands out. There's anger, but he has a lot of power. There's swirling winds around him. So Moses does save these women, and he is given is sort of a negative term, pejorative term, but he is Jethro, in order to thank Moses, offers his daughter Sephora to him. And so Sephora becomes his wife, and in the end, Jethro becomes his father-in-law. So this is a biblical thing from the Old Testament, Exodus, and we can see how different the style is. Now, another really amazing painting by the same artist, Rosso Fiorentino, is a Dead Christ with Angels. Now, I apologize because I think what I probably should have done is shown some facsimile of a Renaissance painting for you to make a comparison. So I do apologize. That probably would have been very effective. But I know that many of you, or all of you, because you're listening in, do have a working knowledge of Renaissance art. So suffice to say, the things I'm going to point out really are a departure. And you might even think about what I'm saying on some of these paintings and maybe go back and look at a few high Renaissance paintings by Raphael and Michelangelo, Leonardo, and see how they sort of depart. All right, so we have this body of Christ that really fills the space. There's like no depth. And this was commissioned by a bishop, and I can't recall for what church it was, but it was a commissioned painting, and it shows a very refined modeling of the body. They appear softer, smoother, more gentle. They're warm. There's this intense light. It's almost, how do I say, I don't want to use the term, let's say mildly erotic, as art historians have pointed out, just mildly erotic, because it is a naked body. He's beautiful. It's soft, it's warm, it's glowing. And in some way, the artist, wanted to exalt the beauty of the human body. And that is really done carefully in this painting. A couple other things you see is Jesus wears a very thin crown of thorns here. We have the angels looking in, and they're dressed in these, again, I said that's complementary colors, red and green, yellow and orange. And then we have down below something kind of interesting. We have vinegar and like a little paintbrush. And the vinegar, you can't really see, but why vinegar? And that's because the Roman soldiers drank vinegar as opposed to wine, which is had a change what is it? Salt, it could make you sleepy, it could make you ineffectual, and also water was a bit contaminated. So vinegar was actually kind of a sports drink for the Roman soldiers. And then another thing I wanted to point out, you don't see any markings on Jesus except for this slight cut in his side, and then it's being pointed to by one of the angels. So very manneristic, that twisted body, really the height of Mannerism. So I mentioned an artist named Pontormo. So Pontormo was an Italian Mannerist. He was a portraitist. He came from the Florentine school. As I mentioned, many of these artists worked in Florence. His perspective is very unique, very unusual, color too. And he had this sort of intense connection to the Medici family. They supported him. They supported the creation of many of these paintings, particularly this one for the chapel. But here we have, again, this Mannerist tradition, elongated bodies, crowded picture plane, twisted forms. So we can almost see this sort of serpentine twist of Jesus as he's literally almost sagging into the weight of the person who's carrying him, the deposition or descent from the cross. So it's a whirling dance of grief. You have the Madonna just in abject grief. We have others circling around him, trying to help. Actually, there is a portrait too. That is Pontormo himself right here. And then something that's really interesting is there's swirling colors and light on the figures, but the ground, and there's one simple little cloud and one little dull ground here. So really the emphasis is on the figures, the coloration, and the twisted, elongated bodies. So this is quite a magnificent chapel painting. Another popular painting, some of these artists are also very well known for their portraiture. And this one has a really interesting story. So the portrait of a halberdier. A halberdier was like a high-ranking military officer. And this particular young man, he's maybe only 14 or 15, and I'll tell you who he probably is. And this is at the J. Paul Getty Museum. I think they paid $35 million for this quite a while back. And he holds this halberd. And a halberd is a spear with an axe at the top. So it's a pretty formidable weapon. This very well-dressed soldier. So he is not of the lower ranks. He has a beautiful hilt of a sword. We have a gold necklace, an embellished hat, and he looks directly at it. And he's kind of giving us a bit of a psychological portrait, like a little bit of dismissiveness on the part of the sitter, but he does look directly at us. He has a very unlined face and a very slim body, almost too slim when you think about it, how the relationship of this billowy garment and then this very, very narrow waist with that deep, exquisite, resonating red. So he leans against a fortress. He's leaning back a bit on the fortress. And he shows kind of, as I said, a complex psychological study, which he was known to do. Sort of, as I mentioned, sort of naive arrogance on the part of this young man, but also the vulnerability of youth. As I said, he's probably 14, 15. Okay, so who was this? At the time, Pontormo was a court painter for the Duke Cosimo di Medici, and who was great at sort of art and propaganda. So some think this might have been the Duke himself at a younger age. Others think it might have been a member of the Guardi family. And you remember the Guardi family were great artists. They painted Venice, and it was a family of artists, and they were of the upper class, of the aristocracy. So we don't know exactly who it is, but suffice to say, it is someone of great importance. All right, so we'll move on. This is just such a wild painting, just wild. And it really, again, it sort of predates the exact period of Mannerism, but holy smokes, this is definitely Manneristic. So the conversion of St. Paul. So let me just give you a few tidbits of information on Parmigianino. Unfortunately, he lived a very short life. Like Raphael, the great Raphael, and the great Giorgione, some of these artists who died so young. And of course, he died of an illness. We're not sure if it's plague or malaria, but he only lived into his 30s. But I'll tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Parma. That's the name Parmigianino. Because remember, a lot of these artists took the name from the region from which they were living, like you'll see this artist, Daniele Volterra. And so he came from the area of Volterra, but we'll talk about him a little bit later. So he became Italy's most influential Mannerist painter. His career was only 20 years in length. His father and uncles taught him how to paint. He did his first altarpiece at the age of 16. He was a genius. But his career was affected by the sack of Rome. He did have to leave Rome. And he was one of the first artists who actually was Italian artist who was very heavily involved in printmaking that kind of distinguished him. So he died of a fever. Again, I don't know exactly if it was a type of plague because it was raging through Europe or if it was malaria. Okay, so the first conversion of St. Paul. The story was that this man, and it was Saul was on the road to Damascus. He was named Saul at that time, and he meant to persecute Christians. He actually has a sword, and he's raging, I'm going to get these Christians, and I don't like this. And he's suddenly bathed in this heavenly light, this exquisite light that comes from the left upper portion of the painting. And again, because there's not an emphasis on perspective, it's really hard for us to say foreground, middle ground, background. So let's say in the upper registers of the painting, we see this light emanating from the clouds. That is, of course, ethereal religious light, heavenly light, and he's dazzled by it. So he falls to the ground, and Saul becomes Paul because he then becomes baptized by this exquisite heavenly light. And he does become a passionate advocate for a new faith of Christianity. It's like highly dramatized version of divine inspiration and intervention. His ecstasy is so profound that it even affects his horse. So let's talk a little bit about the horse. Not realistic at all. I mean, I grew up with horses and never seen a horse like that, but, very, very small head, this, flank here, just outsized, and he looks like a dapple gray, but dapple gray horses don't have this kind of coloration, from what I know. And then this bridle is sort of dangling, and his eyes, he's got these kind of wild eyes, as does Paul. And so Paul is on the ground, he holds his hand out. And then I really want to point out this exquisite, really beautiful landscape that most likely was influenced by northern painters, because remember, there is cross-pollination. And then again, this verdant landscape, and then the sword. So this is quintessential Mannerism. One other painting is the one we talked about earlier. So this, the Madonna with the long neck, again, one of the most important Mannerist paintings. It was made for a funerary chapel in Parma. Okay, so I said his name, Parma. But he died before it was finished. It shows the Virgin Mary. I think I heard Washington Press, maybe a little dog barking. How cute. So it is excuse me, Madonna shown on a pedestal, and she's in an exquisite dress. These robes are really beautiful. They're flowing robes, her gown that sort of shows movement, almost like a draft of air is coming through the room. And we have these 6 angels. And when I looked at the painting many times, it's very hard at first to kind of recognize that there are 6 angels. So I'm going to count them, and I really hope my cursor, I beg your pardon, a cursor points this out. So angel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then an angel that's almost like pentimento, almost just like a shadow, but the angel is there. And then we have a beautiful urn, vase, as it were. And then if you look really carefully, there's a crucifixion, very lightly embossed on the vase. And something very interesting, we have Saint Jerome. And why is that? Because it was said that he had to be included whenever St. Jerome had to be included at this time for whatever reason. And I know we have some important religious scholars on our Timken, our Timken docents, and so who probably could tell me a lot more. But you can see that there is at this time the use of Saint Jerome, and he's very, very diminutive, and he's actually very skinny, like almost starved, and he holds a scroll. But he witnesses this particular scene, and she is on a throne, and then these pillars, and her feet almost enter our view. I mean, they're almost piercing the picture plane. And then, of course, this baby Jesus that is so utterly manneristic in style, and he almost looks like he's going to slide off the lap. And then what is so, I think she's one of the most beautiful and most unusual Madonnas. She has, a crown of jewels, and she has this exquisite elongated neck. It's a very crowded into the picture plane. It's rather enigmatic. And the proportions extremely manneristic. And again, as I mentioned, that term, this serpentine or serpentinata style, where look at the torso kind of goes this way, and the lower part of the body kind of goes that way. And that term is also used in sculpture as well, not just in painting. Okay, we got to move on. And now we're moving into a little bit of the erotic aspects of Manneristic painting. So Antonio da Correggio was a great fresco painter, muralist. He was probably the best painter of the Parma school during the High Renaissance. He was known for his very vigorous, detail, and very sensuous work. The Medici's loved him. He used dynamic composition, illusionistic perspective, especially if you look at some of his ceiling frescoes. He was very, he sort of prefigured what was happening in the Baroque, very important to that. And he is considered a master of the use of chiaroscuro, light and dark. His work was a little moody, a little sullen, but a very well-respected artist. Okay, Leda and the Swan from Greek mythology. Wow, this is an erotic painting. So let's say what's happening. As you might recall, that Zeus was a womanizer, and he was always trying to escape his wife, and she knew that he was not a great guy that way. And so he had to disguise himself in order to continue his exploits. In what form? Well, he would disguise himself into drops of rain and shafts of light and gold coins and eagles and like the Rape of Europa, a bull. And in here, he is a swan. So there are three actual, pardon me, aspects to the painting, and they kind of work backwards. So let's see what happens. Well, not as well, right to left, as it were. So here's Leda. And who was Leda? She was daughter of the king of Aetolia, and she was married to a Spartan king, Tiberius. And she was already married, but she was approached by Zeus and his magnetic personality or whatever, or his powers, as it were, seduce her. So here she is encountering him. Oh, look at the pretty swan. And then she realizes that he's sort of overpowering him, and she accepts him. So there's a very erotic detail. In the center of the painting, she's actually embracing him in a romantic, sensual way. So he's aligned between her knees, and he's, his face is up to hers, and they're engaged in some sort of sensual ritual or dance. And then we have here, so it's a very seductive mythological scene. And then so she's intertwined with the swan, sorry. And then we have, so there's Leda with the swan. And then we have, I believe it is, let's see, we have Tuputi playing musical instruments. And then perhaps we have, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think who this could be. I actually know, but I'm just having a little mental glitch, and it's not that important, we'll move on. But they actually say that the result of this partnering was that she laid eggs, kind of a weird thing, right? All right, another very erotic painting commissioned by one of the nobility is inspired by the writing of Ovid, in his Metamorphoses. And that was a really important inspiration to many of these artists. And so in the painting, in the story, Io, the daughter of the king of Argos, is seduced by Jupiter. Of course, that's the Roman name for Zeus. And I said he also transformed himself. Now, in this case, he's not transforming himself into this kind of cloud of smoke, but he is hiding from Hera, his wife, and you can barely see a face as he kisses her here. And he puts a clouded sort of arm, it almost looks like a paw. It is not, it's just an arm kind of encased in smoke. It swirls around him in this very shallow space. She's in sensual rapture. He envelops her in this dark cloud, and there's bright daylight that sort of shines through. So this was commissioned by the Duke of Mantua, Federico Gonzaga, for his Jupiter room. So many of these artists, the Gonzaga, Sforza, Medici families, wanted these erotic paintings for their rooms, in mythological rooms that sometimes they, for private viewing and that sort of thing. So as I always run a little late, I'm going to kind of move on. So Bronzino too was a remarkable artist. I happen to really love his work. It's so unusual. He was a leading painter in Florence, according to Vasari, and he had a very polished, elegant way of painting and very detailed. And this was really beloved by the aristocracy. He used classical stylistic aspects, but he also went into some very unusual manneristic details. And he did study with Pontormo. They considered him kind of an eccentric. He was sort of an eccentric guy, and he worked a lot for the Duke of Florence. Okay, so let's talk about this very erotic painting, The Allegory of Venus and Cupid by Bronzino. So Venus is in a very, again, I hope I'm not, this is art. She's in a very almost erotic pose with Cupid. He's very elongated, again, in that serpentine kind of way, and he does hold her in a romantic way. But it does describe sort of the vices of mankind. So what was happening at this time in Florence? Syphilis was raging. It was a very kind of lusty time. And so syphilis was raging. And so in some ways, this painting does comment on us, the folly of romantic love. And so time is represented with the ubiquitous memento mori, which is a hourglass. And then we have this creature. Oh my gosh, this creature, and she's considered to be deceit. And this creature has this beautiful young woman's face. But if you look further, she's offering honeycomb to here to Venus, and Venus actually holds the apple of Paris, the gold apple, which relates to another mythology, aspect of mythology. And there's these rose petals that are being kind of strewn. But this creature right here throws rose petals. But look at this creature holding the honeycomb. But then if you look carefully, there is a serpent tail that is, going to pierce you and maybe even poison you. And then we have an empty head, empty-headedness. And then we also have, so that's sort of oblivion. And then we have anger. So it relates to the sins of mankind. It's also very erotic and mythologically driven painting. So Bronzino was an incredible portrait painter, as many of these artists were. And he paints Eleonora de Toledo and her son. And so Giovanni was the second son of hers, and he was destined to be in the papal realm. And, of course, many of these Medici families were highly connected to the higher levels of the papacy. So here we have Eleonora, and she's standing with her son. Now, I want to tell you, I will preface this by saying it was a tragic painting because she does die. Both of them died not too long after this was painted. But she is in this magnificent, almost ecclesiastically styled gown. And she has the pearls. I always talk about the pearls. Remember the bling of that time, very, very expensive. He's dressed in a lovely costume. You see some embellishments with pomegranate and pine cone. That was representative of that house. And she is shown as a very strong and powerful woman, what she was, because she stands behind a background that is blue, and that blue, that lapis that comes from Afghanistan. And, we know later Jan Vermeer had a wealthy patron who produced or brought lapis to create so that deep blue in his paintings, but we see it here too. It's almost like a blue of the Madonna. So it kind of, there's a reference there. very expensive. And one thing I do want to point out too is that even though she looks like this just profoundly beautiful woman who's, a aristocrat, she also had a very, very strong position in upper government. So it wasn't that she was just this Florentine heiress type person. She was a very important person. All right, so Sebastiano del Piombo, he actually held the seal of the papal seal. So he's a really important artist. He did monumental religious paintings, very grand. And he was trained by Bellini and Giorgione, some of my favorite artists of the Venice school. So I'm running out of time, as I always do. So I'm going to have to go a little bit quickly on this one. So this is Madonna and Child with Saints and Donors. So look how different this Madonna is. She's much more sculptural and stylistically. There is such a crowding of the picture plane, that use of complementary colors. And then we have, of course, the baby Jesus sort of turned, looking at the donors, kind of unusual, and the friars. And so these are the donors. Instead of at the side, like in an altarpiece, they are crowded into the picture plane. So I'm going to go on because we have so much more to talk about. Here's another painter, Volterra, and I'm only going to tell you just a little bit about him, in that his name comes from Volterra, the town in Tuscany. And I'll tell you a really funny story, and I probably have told you this before, but just really quickly. There is a beautiful Corot in the Timken collection, and I always admired it. And every time I'm in the Timken, I just look at it, I study it, and I wanted to know more about this town, Volterra. So Volterra, as I mentioned, is in Tuscany, not too far from Florence, and it was a site of Etruscan civilization, predates the Romans, and it also had medieval ruins and Roman ruins. So it is a very important town. And he was named after that town. And what Volterra did, which is very unique, is after the Last Judgment fresco by Michelangelo, which I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, was completed, some of the papal members did not like all the nudity. So Volterra was asked to paint sort of the fig leaves, or as it were, on the nude portions of the painting. So he kind of has a unique job that he did. Okay, so let's just talk about Elijah in the desert. And just really quickly, Elijah is wandering the desert, and you can see the painting looks very sculptured, almost like a Michelangelo, which he definitely had seen. So it's the prophet Elijah, and he's reflecting on that he has been brought bread, and the bread was on like a branch and was proffered by a raven. And we see a theological reference to the Eucharist. So that is just kind of the story about this. And then we have, of course, this exquisite landscape. But again, for time, I'm going to go on. Paolo Veronese. Okay, so we also have a Veronese in the Timton, which I'm going to show you. He's belonged to a very important circle of influential, important painters in the 16th century. He lived near the town of Verona, actually considered a Venetian painter. He was apprenticed in a Venetian studio. He was very influenced by Raphael and Michelangelo. Now, he was sort of panned for some of his, including buffoons and drunkards and stuff in his painting, but suffice to say, he had a very important career. In fact, he had so many commissions that when he died, his family had to finish them because people loved him. Okay, so quickly, we're going to look at the wedding feast at Cana. I always tell people this. You go to the Louvre Museum and everybody, with good reason, rushes to see the Mona Lisa. And I encourage everyone to see the Mona Lisa. It is a magnificent painting. However, this is a magnificent painting too, and it's really large. There's something like 130 characters. It's gigantic. And it covers a whole back wall near the Mona Lisa. And many people miss it because it's like perpendicular. And so people rush in to see the Mona Lisa and they forget that this is just an incredible monumental painting. So the story is in the Gospel of St. John, at which the first miracle attributed to Christ occurs. And Jesus has been invited to this wedding in Cana, and he's seated central, and he's looking directly at us. And his mother is here. And then we have the wedding, the groom and bride. And unfortunately, sort of a drunk looking guy, very red faced, red nose, is looking directly in a sort of inappropriate way at the bride. And we have all manner of animals and musicians and these amphorae, these Greek style containers, and they're filled with, at one point they were wine, but then everybody's drinking and enjoying themselves, and the wine runs out. And so what Christ is able to do is he's able to turn the water into wine. And so he's covering 150 years of sacred and profane love and devotion. So sacred, of course, being the reference to Jesus and his miracle, but also the profane of a wedding. And it's funny because some people say, this, because of this miracle related to wine, it shows that Jesus was accepting of this kind of celebratory experience. One thing I love in this painting are these exquisite Corinthian capitals. And then we also have these Doric capitals. I'm looking at the flat Doric, which was the original, and of evolution from Ionic scrolled to Corinthian. All right, time necessitates me going a little more quickly. So this is in the Timken collection. Is wonderful. Madonna and Child of St. Elizabeth, the infant St. John, and St. Catherine. So St. Catherine was in a luxurious garment. She looks at the baby Jesus. She's often dressed in finery, the pearls in her hair. She was of the aristocratic level. And then we have Mary and Elizabeth, who was the mother of St. John. And she's rolling laundry, and it's against this sort of rustic backdrop. Very beautiful landscape here. But both Elizabeth and the Virgin Mary look at their children, and they look with sadness because they know in their heart that their children will suffer. So they know that they prophesize the fate, and then, of course, we see the look on their faces. Again, I'm moving a little more quickly. I apologize. Okay, so Sofonisba Anguissola was a great Mannerist painter, and she was so brilliant that even Michelangelo noticed her when she was in her early 20s and said, we've got to sort of sponsor this young woman. So she came from sort of this is oxymoronic. She came from sort of a poor aristocratic family. They'd run out a lot of their money, but they were still born, both sides, mother and father, as aristocrats. So she was connected to higher level circles. She had 6 sisters and 1 brother. All of the sisters were gifted artists. However, one died young, probably even more successful and talented than Sofonisba, but she died young. And then another one was went to a convent. So really her career was the most inspiring, and she lived to something like 93. So she worked in the courts of Spain, she worked in the courts of Italy, she knew all the great artists. She worked for Elizabeth of Valois in the Spanish court, and she adapted a very interesting style. Now, in the beginning, it was very difficult for her to paint strangers. So she did a whole series of paintings of her family. She had some older sisters, and then she had a younger brother and some younger sisters. So just really quickly, this is such an amusing portrait because the little boy looks sort of with bemusement as he holds this lap dog. And this young sister here holds a feathered fan, and she's almost like looking at the viewer like, yeah, these are my siblings. They're a little bit nutty, but it's unusual. It's very, you get a lot of insight into her family, and that's what was so wonderful about her portraits, that you not only got insight into the aristocracy, but also of her own family. And so we have to talk a little bit about El Greco. I know I only have a few minutes, and I might go up to 12, and hopefully we can go a little bit over, but I promise I won't talk more than to 12. So El Greco, the Greek, he was born on the island of Crete. He was actually an icon painter of the Byzantine style, Greek Orthodox as it were, but he got tired of sort of just painting icons, and he goes to Spain, to Toledo, where he had this magnificent career. His style is very unique. Now, it used to say, oh, he had astigmatism and it's all about, eye issues. That's rather disputed. It is really that he had a unique vision and style. So this painting, The Burial of Count Orgaz, is considered his magnus opus, his masterpiece. It's in Toledo at a convent or a monastery. So it was used to house religious relics. I apologize for, but it's in the Toledo Cathedral. So it depicts a moment when Christ has ascended to Calvary. That's in the upper register. And then we also have this burial of this count who was so philanthropic. And he was so philanthropic, he gave so much to the city of Toledo and religious orders that Saint Stephen on the left and Saint Peter on the right are so enamored of his gifts that they bury him. They hand bury him. And so it's such a miracle, really. And we have everything with these beautiful crucifixions and all these viceroys from the Spanish clergy and aristocracy here and here. And then we have the swirling mass. So it also shows, heaven and the temporal world. Really pretty amazing. And then we have the three Marys. Oh no, we'll skip that because again, I see that Mary is here and up here. So we'll go on just really quickly. And I believe, okay, the disrobing of Christ. I want to talk just, if we can, just a minute. I love this painting. I think it's just so remarkable. So again, El Greco has the disrobing of Christ in a very condensed space, beautiful colors, this resonant red and this red and yellow and blue. And so what's happening? They're trying to take the garments off of Christ and in this very vigorous and vicious and painful way. So what do we have? We have the three Marys and they're just absorbed in grief. We have this fellow here, he's nailing, trying to get everything set for the cruise, for this cross here. We have a man holding the rope on Jesus very taut, and he's about to rip off his clothes. And then we have these, military figures in the back, in right here in this beautiful garb here, and it just, you see the pain look on some of their faces, but Jesus is portrayed as in a very calm and spiritual way. So he is not seeming to be so affected by what is happening, whereas all the swirling mass of humanity. But look at the colors, look at the condensed space, look at the elongation of the figures, the muscular, the movement, just so classically Manneristic. So just, in the 1 minute I have really quickly, I just want to talk about that we did have stylistically some cross-pollination of Mannerism in the North, particularly in Germany. And this painting, for example, by Hans von Eycken is Bacchus, Ceres, and Amor. And the reason why I want to just show you really quickly, you have perfect serpentine style of Ceres here. And we also have, she was a goddess of fertility, and of course, Bacchus, a goddess of wine, god of wine, sorry, and Eros, who's offering fruit. And he holds her, he's got these grapes. And so this painting, very Manneristic, northern, it shows the elongation of the body. It shows the surface of the northern painters, a little more detailed, a little cooler light, particularly on the body. And so it kind of combines Italian Mannerist painting with some of the aspects of the North. So he touches her rather tenderly. He looks directly at her. She's very beautiful. That little head and serpentine body. So I'm just going to show you one last artist. I apologize. I do want to show you that probably the greatest proponent of Mannerism in the North was the great Jan Bruegel the Elder. So Jan Bruegel the Elder, called Velvet Bruegel, worked in the studio of Peter Paul Rubens, and he often collaborated with Rubens, Flemish painters, because he was such a great still life painter and landscape painter. So often they collaborated, because remember, if you look at our brilliant Peter Bruegel the Elder in the Timken Museum, the Parable of the Sower, you can see that this history of landscape painting was very pervasive in his family. So here we have a woodland road with travelers, and this is the last painting we'll talk about. And what I want to point out to is, it really talks about the cycle of life, because in the foreground of this magnificent landscape, we have probably a little bit upper class equestrian people here, and then we have the peasants working, and they're showing like sort of ashes, ashes, dust to dust. So they're working, but then of course we have the bones of a horse. So it shows that there is a cycle of life, and these people were very connected to genre painting. The Bruegel family, they were connected to the landscape and still life. So it would take probably a whole nother hour to talk about the Northern Mannerist paintings, but suffice to say, it really is a movement and a style that is quintessentially Italian. So I see that we're right at noon, and I apologize for going over. And maybe Sarah could let us know if there are any questions. And so I will just wait for Sarah to jump back on, and here she is. Sarah, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We have one from Ryan who says, did Mannerist art have a smaller fan base in its time with Correggio's Leda and Swan, for example? I wonder, was that considered appropriate for public or women to view, or was it seen as erotic art for private enjoyment by a select few?
Excellent question. Excellent question. The most erotic paintings were more for the private residence of the aristocracy. So they would have, the Duke of Mantua, for example, they would have in their palaces rooms filled with, like, let's say, the exploits of Jupiter, Zeus, as it were, and they would show him, within these erotic, like the Leda and the Swan or the Rape of Europa. So they were not like put in churches, obviously, and not really for public viewing, more for their friends and family. So that's an excellent question because they were very erotic. And I haven't even I could show you one that I didn't even talk about. So this is Northern. This is the Cologne school. So this is a little different, but it does show you the level of, it does show you the level of erotic elements to this. Oh, I totally apologize. There, sorry. I guess I'll just keep it at that. But yeah, some of them were like this one, very erotic, the Three Graces. So yes, that's Ryan, that was a really good question. I hope I answered it properly or to your satisfaction. Any other questions, Sarah?
Yeah,
I have one. I'm Marianne.
Oh,
And the
hi.
question, I don't know why it's 007746, but anyway, my question is, what was so manneristic about that painting of the portrait of the artist with the sisters and the brothers? I mean, it didn't look
Okay. That's a really, I'm gonna refer to it here. Here we go. I think part of it is not as elaborately manneristic. And look, we're really late into the period. So you might say, well, we're well into the established Mannerist style. But what kind of, I would say, is it shows that portraiture has taken a little bit of a turn because it is so, there's this psychological aspect that is infused in many Mannerist paintings. When I showed you this painting, for example, you might say, okay, this does have a more overtly Manneristic style with that very narrow waist and a little tiny head, but it's the psychological dimension to it. And the fact that she shows her siblings kind of in this bemused style. But again, he crowds the picture plane, as you notice. The way the bodies are turned a little bit, but it's not overt. It isn't. That's a good question too, because I'll show you one that, like this, is so hyper. This has all the stylistic concerns of Mannerism, but sometimes when we put a painting, a work of art in a category, it can sometimes sort of bleed into other categories. So that's a very smart question, and I hope I answered, but in a way, it's not as overly Manneristic, and probably I should have included maybe another example, but she did such great portraits, so I just wanted to show that. But you have a good point. Any more questions?
Yes, we have one more from Ryan who asks, in the timeline, was El Greco the last or one of the, or sorry, I think he's asking if El Greco was one of the first or last Mannerists.
Okay, so if you look at the dates, again, a really good question because he's predating, he predates the Baroque, but he's very late into Mannerism. So what happens is we always include El Greco in, we'll put him in the Baroque, which really starts at 1600 at the end of the Mannerist period. But because of his very unusual stylistic concerns, he kind of is in both camps. But he's a later Mannerist, definitely a later Mannerist. Because if you look at the date, by now we're starting to evolve out of Mannerism. And Mannerism is really, I said 1530 to 1600, but it's really like the thick of it, 1520 really, into about 1560. So he's a late Mannerist edging into the Baroque. So we kind of put them in both categories. But that's another good question.
Any more questions, anyone? Well, that's all that's in the chat right now. I don't know if Scott, there's any on Facebook. No questions from Facebook. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. So thank you so much, Karen, for the tour. And before everyone goes, I'd just like to remind you again that we do have all of our tours recorded on our Facebook page. So those are available at any time, 24/7, to be viewed over and over again if you just love them so much. So
Oh.
with that said, thank you for joining us. Have a nice rest of your day. And thank you so much, Karen.
Yes, thank you all for joining in, and I really appreciate your viewing. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, and I will clock out, I guess. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Keep me posted on the numbers, okay?